it is my pleasure to introduce our very special guest. I'm going to do my very best not to fangirl too ridiculously, but I can't make any promises because this is one of my favorite authors. Olivia Dade is the nationally best-selling author of over a dozen romance novels. Her most recent release, All the Feels, is the second book in her big-hearted, delightfully funny, and swooningly romantic spoiler alert series. Olivia describes herself as an undeniable lifelong nerd who has always been prone to ignoring the world around her in favor of reading any book that she could find. Her favorites, though, were always romances. She earned a master's degree in American history and has worked in a variety of fields since then, including historical interpreter in colonial Williamsburg, high school teacher, and a librarian. However, she has now achieved her lifelong goal of wearing pajamas all day as a hermit-like writer. She's living the dream. She lives with her delightful family and burgeoning book collection just outside of Stockholm. And that is where she's joining us from today. So everybody say hi to Olivia Dade.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very grateful and honored to be here.
I'm super excited, and we have lots of people who joined us today. So I want to go ahead and get started with this conversation. I have been looking forward to this for months. You wrote in one of your blog entries that one of the great joys of romance novels is their fundamental optimism. And I wanted to start there because I really think that this is what I love most about romance novels. But what does that mean to you? What does it mean that your books are fundamentally optimistic?
I mean, as a genre, as opposed to just sort of love stories in general, the romance genre has only really one requirement, which is that there be a happy ending. And it could be a happily ever after or a happy for now ending if they're sort of just beginning a relationship. But that is really it. It can be set in space. It could be set in Viking times. It could be set... It could be vampires, it can be really spicy, or it can be kisses only. Really, there is the only requirement. You can tell mysteries that have a romance. There's romantic suspense. All the other genres romance encompasses. The only requirement is a happy ending. And what that means is that even when things look bleak, the bleak moment in many romances where all seems lost, right? Often if there's a couple, they break up at some point, that there is the promise that no matter how terrible things may be in the moment and how it looks like there's no possible way forward that will lead to an ending that is happy and an ending that will leave you feeling good as a reader and that you can cheer for as a reader. That's what you're going to get. It's really one of the major sort of challenges of the genre is how to make you somehow, even though you know that it's going to end happily, to somehow make it hurt when you're in that bleak moment and make readers sort of, even though they know that it's going to end happily, to make them sweat at that point in a story, or make them, not all books have necessarily that moment, but to sort of make you question the moment, well, how can this work out? Like, in what possible way is this going to be resolved? And the promise of romance is it will be resolved. So if you look at your own life, it's a way to sort of say, if you're going through difficult times yourself, I think sometimes it's really comforting to look to romances and say, maybe there's a way forward here that I'm not seeing right now.
I love that. Yeah. And I, especially the last couple of years, have really been turning to these books because I have that sort of desire for that. I just need to know. I just need to know that it's going to go well.
Mm-hmm.
So most recently, I've picked up your spoiler alert series and have not only combined this fun in the sense that like I know that the ending is going to go well, but a lot of other things is like sort of like nerdy background fandom thing. And the most recent one, I wanted to start there and we can kind of work backwards to some of your other books. Most recent one, All the Fields, in the way of many romance novels, is a sequel because it happens around the setting of your first book, but it stands alone by itself. But what was like less common, at least in books that I've read, was that the stories overlapped with each other. And so I was just curious about how you ended up with that book. Like, did you know you were going to get from A to B when you started? Did you already plan it with this overlap? How did that happen? Because I was so interested.
I would love to tell you that that was all deliberate. But it was not deliberate on my part. Originally, the contract that I signed with Avon, the book one was going to be spoiler alert, which it was. And then book two was going to be Maria and Peter's story, which is now book three. And what happened was during the writing of spoiler alert, when I was planning spoiler alert, because I am someone who does sort of plot things out ahead of time, I knew that Marcus was going to have a BFF, right? He is going to have a close friend who is also on the cast. And so, but I didn't really plan what his personality would be like. And then when I was talking with my editor through what I had planned for the book, and this is again, spoiler alert, because I'm going to give you some spoilers for the book.
Well, just a couple. I mean, yeah. Sorry.
That I had originally planned for people to find out that Marcus had written fanfic. And my editor said, well, what happens then if he blows up his career? Like you can't have him be found out. I'm like, oh, well, okay, well then it'll serve the same purpose essentially if his best friend, this happens, and then it becomes clear to April that these are the possible consequences. And it's part of the reason that he did not share this secret beforehand. Of who he is, that, he was her best friend online. So that was really clean. It was going to be really neat. And then I started writing, and Alexander Woodrow, who is Marcus's best friend, sort of leapt off the page in a way that occasionally happens, but not that often. And he just was so much fun to write. Like all the scenes that he was in, he was just a really bright spark in those scenes, to the point where by the time I finished the book, I was like, I want to write his book. I want to write a book for him. You know how authors try to sort of set up who the next main characters are going to be in their next book if they're set in the same universe. It's called sequel baiting, right? This may be the first time in writer history that I sequel baited myself. I had no intention of writing his book, but then at the end, it was, I really want to write his book next. And that sort of informed then, as I went back to do revisions, it informed a little bit about his personality, because I had to explain. I dodged it in spoiler alert, but now I had to say, well, what does happen after you've blown up your career, right? Because I didn't have to do it for Marcus, but now I had to do it for Alex. And so that sort of informs what his personality was going to be like. And I felt like the hints we had gotten of him and Lauren in the background in spoiler alert were intriguing to me as well. Not playing it all out. So when I wanted to sort of show how they got to the point where he has this big blow up at the convention, Con of the Gates, and then move past it. So because of sort of the story I decided to tell about them, then there was overlapping timelines, which incidentally was a real pain in the butt. So I'm not sure that's something I'm going to do again. There is a small amount of overlap in the third book in the series, because we revisit Con of the Gates from yet another point of view, although we don't belabor the other stuff that happens, but there's going to be yet more drama.
I was wondering, I'm like, man, you have to have so many notes to get all of those together. But what you said, that Alex was such a big character. I have tremendous book amnesia. Like I'll read a book, but I read a lot. I mean, I'm a librarian and a bookworm, so like I sometimes will forget the details of a person. Alex, I remembered, and Lauren, I remembered. I loved both of them in that, and so hearing that that was going to be their story next, I was so excited about it. One of the things that I loved about Lauren that is that she's not like traditionally beautiful, and she doesn't have that like description that she's like, oh, she was, you know, she's fat, but she's beautiful, you know. She is, you describe her as fat and short and a beaky nose and she looks like a bird, and all of these things that traditionally are not paired together in a romance heroine. And then none of that is an impediment to Alex at all, because like he's fascinated by every single like unique detail about her. So I was wondering how you settled on her looks, on her description, if it was intentional from the beginning that she was going to have this very particular appearance, or if it grew out of something.
I think there are two separate things happening when I sort of planned out the character of Lauren. The first is that I believe very much in body diversity within fatness. It feels like that if you have fat characters in romance, generally they're always described again as beautiful, but also that they are someone who, yes, if they are someone who, if they lost weight, would be considered conventionally attractive, right?
Right.
Also, they almost always have an hourglass figure, as if that is the only sort of fat body that could possibly be attractive to someone. So one of my goals for my career is to show different types of bodies within fatness, because there are people who do have hourglass figures and they're beautiful, but there are people who have more apple shapes or pear shapes or more rectangles, and there is no one type of body that cannot be loved or desired. You know, there is not a weight beyond which no one can love you or desire you anymore. And you don't have to be someone who would be conventionally attractive if you lost weight to be loved or desired. So it was important to me to have someone who very clearly was not someone who, even if Lauren lost weight, she would not be considered beautiful by most people in society. You know, and Alex sees her very clearly, but just finds her completely fascinating and desirable. And it's not that somehow, you know, again, that she would be considered gorgeous if she lost weight. It's just that he thinks that she's amazing and just loves looking at her, you know, and that was important to me. The other thing is that there is a certain amount of callbacks to Game of Thrones throughout the series. And in this particular book, in All the Feels, the callback is hearkening a little bit to the Jaime Lannister Brienne of Tarth relationship. And, you know, one of the things that I found when I was in that, you know, having been in that fandom, one of the things I found very appealing about it was that Brienne of Tarth, again, is very overtly not someone who is traditionally attractive at all. Now, not in the same way as Lauren. Like Brienne of Tarth is meant to be sort of big and muscular and so forth. So it's not the same type of body, but I wanted to sort of, that was part of the resonance for me, a lot of the resonance for me of Brienne of Tarth. So I wanted to echo that in sort of a roundabout way with Lauren.
Yes, I definitely caught the Game of Thrones, not only like in the show, but in that sort of relationship. And I was wondering from there, so I saw this sort of like Jaime Brienne there, and I was wondering, like, am I wrong catching the Jaime Brienne in spoiler alert as well? Or is there a different relationship that I didn't like twig onto there? Maybe?
I think what I did was, because that was really my big fandom. Like I spent a year and a half reading nothing but fandom. Fanfic, is that in spoiler alert, it was more about the position of, I sort of thought about the position of the actors in the final season of Game of Thrones. Mm-hmm. Now I'm not saying that they didn't like the final season either, but there were interviews where, as I've said before, sort of look like impromptu hostage videos when they're talking about it, sort of famously. So I was thinking, okay, I'm not trying to write Nikolai Coster-Waldau or any of the other people there.
Yeah.
But if you were in that position and you hated the final season of this huge TV show that you've been in, you think that it's just going off the rails, but you can't say anything because you can't criticize your own production, how would you get that out? And then I sort of put that together with sort of the fanfic element, that fanfic could be one way to do that. So that was more how I drew on Game of Thrones for that book. All of the Fields is sort of drawing on, again, more the actual story within Game of Thrones of sort of the Jaime Lannister, Brienne of Tarth. There's some callbacks. They're obviously extremely different characters. There's no twincest.
Thank you very much for that, because it's extremely uncomfortable.
Everyone has their hands still.
Also excellent. Thank you.
But I mean, there are some things, I mean, and some of them I don't think most people caught, and that's fine, but they amuse me, which is how they meet on the battlefield at the beginning. And basically he's being held hostage in some ways by his producer. So sort of the Lady Catelyn figure in this, and that Lauren is sort of serving him in that case, just as Brienne served Lady Catelyn, and that they're basically going to be stuck together and traveling together. And basically the blow up at Con of the Gates in some ways was meant to be my homage to the bear pit like moment where you're like, no, that was really a really bad decision. But he's doing it because he wants to, like, it's an act, a self-sacrificial act to save someone out of caring for that person. I mean, if you have one hand and like no way out of the bear pit, and like there's a big old bear, like there's no reason he should have survived it, right? And there's no reason that Alex's career should have survived. It's sort of meant to be, if you squint a little bit, meant to be sort of kind of like that moment.
Yeah, I can definitely see it. So and now I'm admitting this on the internet as well, right along with you, I have also read Jaime Brand fan fiction and various others. And one of the things that I love that fan fiction has, and romance novels too, is the tropes, those tropes that you can expect to read, or like if you're reading them online, you see them like tagged in there, that you've got like Grumpy Sunshine, or there's only one bed at the inn, or whatever. And that was one of the things that I loved. Spoiler alert, has a little bit, but All the Fields is very tropey, and it like picks up both the ones that they talk about, but then also like just the ones that are happening in the background. And you've got, things like Friends to Lovers, Forced Proximity, There's Only One Dead, and then the one that I won't, you could talk about it if you want to, because it's your book and you could spoil your own thing, but I didn't want to spoil the ending. But it's my favorite one. Like, I started crying. The last one that you throw in there was my favorite. But I'm wondering if you have a favorite trope of your own, like not just the ones that you put in your own books or whatever, but one that's either your favorite to write or your favorite to read, or both.
If I were to have my own OTP on Archive of Our Own, it would be Olivia Dade / Forced Proximity. Because for me, both in reading and in writing, I love to have, in my case, I have couples. So I usually like to have both of them on the page together as quickly as possible and as often as possible. Because to me, that's the part I find the most, I'm reading it for the romance. And it's not to say that you shouldn't have outside scenes with family members or friends or at work and so forth, because you want to create well-rounded characters. But for me, like, the point is the romance, which means unless they're, it's an epistolary romance where they're exchanging letters, you got to have them on the page together. Of course, that's actually putting them on the page together too, with chats and so forth, if you wanted to do that. So that is definitely, I hit forced proximity hard in all the fields, and Shipwrecked, the third book, is like, yeah, that is hardcore forced proximity as well.
Okay.
So,
I'm very much looking forward to that then. That's always a fun one. I do like when you get to actually you see the romance build in a romance novel, as opposed to like, they're separate and you're told that they really care about each other, but I'm like, but I want to see them interact with each other. You do that very well, that sort of interaction and dialogue. This is not a segue question at all, but out of left field because I wanted to get to it. As a native Floridian, I noticed that Alex is also from Florida, and I was very curious how that ended up happening, because I don't see a lot of native Floridian in fiction that's written outside or about somewhere else.
I grew up in the Virginia, Maryland area, but my grandparents lived in Florida. And in the summers, we would often take a car and we would drive down the Florida coast, down 95, to one of my grandparents or both my grandparents' homes in Florida. So I'm relatively familiar with that. Also, one of my good college friends, who's still a friend today, actually was West Palm Beach, now lives elsewhere, but still lives in Florida. And for whatever reason, it just felt right to me for Alex that particularly, I remember on those trips when we went up and down the coast. I mean, just like any place, but there are these motels, like these older motels. And the sort of story that I created for his background, where you have a single mom, like a devoted single mom, but a single mom who's like working really hard to keep them together and give him opportunities for a future that she didn't necessarily have, and wants to give him that sort of sense of, she wants to give her kid a vacation, and she wants to give her kid a sense of sort of cultural enrichment and see different places and go different places. And she wants that for herself too. And so it was so easy for me to picture going up and down the coast and going up and down on 95, and this mother-daughter road trips that would mean everything to him, where they go to some of these cheap hotels, but it doesn't matter because you're by the water and like there's the ocean, and you can, and I remember if you spent much time in Florida, like the thunderstorms roll in,
Description of that was like, oh, she's been here. That was what sealed it. I'm like, I don't know, maybe she just picked Florida out of a map. It was the thunderstorm description that I'm like, oh no, she's done this.
Yeah, my aunt lives down in Tampa too, so like I visited, and I mean, bless you, like my grandparents, they never lived in like coastal or anything. They lived in places that were just incredibly hot in the summer. So we did not. I think that the Alex's road trips were perhaps a little more fun than some of my visits, but that was one of the hallmarks is, the afternoon comes by, the clouds start thickening, and then there come the thunderstorms. So, yep.
That was it. So I just had to ask because I'm like, there's has to be something there. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to ask a little bit about some of your older series. And I was just wondering, are you ever thinking that you'll revisit like Maryburgh, like your Maryburgh stories, or the Love Unscripted, or are those like done in your mind?
I would like to revisit Marysburg, in part because I left Belle in 40 Love. Tess, who is the female main character, has a best friend named Belle. And I sort of left her in a not great position. And I will tell you why, which is that originally Belle's name was April. And that was meant to be part of April's backstory, was meant to be what was happening with Belle. But when I sold the idea for, spoiler alert, to a publisher, they did not actually want, they liked 40 Love, but they're like, I think that's, that wasn't the one that they wanted to publish at that time. So they're like, you need to separate the two stories. And I guess I could have gone back and like written an entirely separate like secondary plot for Belle, but instead I just copied and replaced April. Well,
well, I definitely now need to go back and reread it and like reread it with that sort of like, just I need to see it that way because that's so funny. Like I never would have guessed.
I changed a few things like work stuff and things like that, but you know, it was meant to be, her character is meant to be again quite similar to April. That if I would like to write a book for her, but her character in her own book would have to veer from April because I try not to write the same characters repeatedly. Love Unscripted I enjoyed, but a lot of people do not love novellas. I love novellas. I love reading them and writing them, but a lot of people do not love them. I think the response in general has been better for the Marysburg books as opposed to the Love Unscripted books. So probably I'm much more likely to come back to Marysburg.
Okay. And then I think, okay, so this is me being a very, very nosy librarian, because I have not yet been able to get my hands on the Love Struck Librarian series, but I did see that I think you posted that you got your rights to it back. So congratulations on that. Do you think that they'll be released again, or are they going to just stay in the vault and everybody who saw them saw them?
I think, have you tried interlibrary loan? I'm sure you obviously know interlibrary loan. But like
I need to dig a little deeper. I tried to buy them and I couldn't, and then I tried looking at our library system, didn't have them, but I will keep searching. I'm not giving up.
So the Love Struck Librarians was the first series I wrote. I started writing in 2014. And I sold the first book in the Love Struck Librarian series in 2014. It was literally the second book I ever wrote. And I think that's pretty evident. When you read it, it is not, I think there are good elements to it. You can sort of see some parts of what I would consider my writing voice now, but it is very much I was learning to write, and I think that that's pretty clear. Okay. I still love some of the stories, but at least one of the stories too, actually the final story in the series, I know that it would have to go through some edits as well, because there were aspects of, Mary is not necessarily fat, but she has a history of disordered eating, as do I. And at the time I wrote it, I was not that far distant from that. And I think I was still sorting through some stuff in my head, and it came out on the page in a way that I would not put it on the page today. And I would be concerned that it would be harmful. So, I mean, I think the question becomes, how much time do you devote to like overhauling stories that I wrote 7-8 years ago versus writing new stories? And that's the trade-off. And it's a hard decision because there's a lot that I still love about many of those stories. But if I'm gonna reissue one, I really got to reissue basically all of them, and that would mean a significant amount of work for revising some of them to make sure that there's nothing in there that I would be ashamed or to put out now, or that I would potentially find harmful for readers.
Thank you. That's yeah, I didn't even think about it from that perspective, but that's a really, that's an interesting way to look at it. And yeah, we also want your new books, so I'm definitely not going to be one who's like, oh no, don't write any new books. I had a couple other just sort of out of curiosity, do you have a favorite character in any of your books, or is that one of those like picking a favorite child type things that you can't do?
I think that all my characters contain pieces of me in one way or another. I think the character who is the least like me is Alex. And in some ways, I think that makes him more fun to write, and because he's a very distinct personality, and I find him hilarious. It was so much fun to write his dialogue and his interior sort of monologue when he's thinking. One of my goals for all this is, sorry, writer nerdery, so I apologize ahead of time. I try to have a different goal for each book. And one of my goals for all the feels was to make sure that when you were in the point of view of Alex, that you should be able to tell that immediately, even if I didn't tell you, just because what he says and how he thinks is so different from Lauren. And so one of my goals, because Marcus and April are more similar characters, they have very different life experiences, but they're actually quite similar. So their points of view are not as distinct. And one of the things I really wanted to do with all the feels is make it so that if you were reading a chapter and you got 2 sentences in, you should know this is Alex or this is Lauren. Like, it should be very clear to you. And that is actually quite fun for me to write, is someone who has that sort of distinctive personality. In the Love Struck Librarian series, the 4th book, it was a novella, Ready to Fall. Sarah, who's the female main character, is a drama queen. And I had a lot of fun writing her, because like she's always making these grand proclamations that like these things are going to kill her, and she doesn't really mean it, but she's like, it is like the surface of the sun out here, like basically I'm like a rotisserie chicken, but at least my meat will be juicy and like well basted. Like, she just makes sort of pronouncements like that I found a lot of fun. So I think characters like that, if you can give them some emotional weight too, that they're not just one-dimensional. So one of the things I fought with is to make sure that Alex, hopefully, is not just sort of entertaining and a chaos demon, but has some emotional gravitas to him, right? That you sort of understand why he is the way he is, that he is unmistakably human, and that you see that you have a sense of sort of emotional connection to him, apart from just finding him entertaining. And yeah, I really loved writing both of them and their interaction, but I think Alex was a lot of fun to write.
You definitely met your goal as far as I'm concerned, because I loved being in his head. I mean, definitely Chaos Goblin 100%, but I could tell it was what he was thinking. And then Lauren with her like big harpy energy, which I also very much loved, that like really dry sense of humor was hysterical. Do you have any characters that didn't turn out the way that you expected? So you had, you talked about sort of some goals that you had for these characters, but did you have any that you're like, okay, well, that's not who I thought you were going to be, but here you are?
I mean, Alex is the biggest exemplar of that, really, because actually, I probably shouldn't even say this, but like if you look at it, the first time he appears on the page, and spoiler alert, he's on the phone with Marcus, who's explaining the whole situation, like the whole convoluted situation with April. And Alex basically says almost nothing. He's just like, don't be a jerk. And like, you know what you need to do. I mean, I know Alex was super tired in that scene, and I could sort of hand wave that away. But in reality, I had not nailed down his character yet, because I had not planned his character. So like the way he turned out ended up being, I did not anticipate that. And you can actually kind of still see that in the first conversation, because he usually, why use 5 words when you can use 500 words to say? So that was sort of out of character for him. Again, I'm just going to say he was very tired. He was still filming in Spain. It was late at night, but like, still. We
can do one of those. That's fine. Well, I definitely want to give everybody else who's here a chance to ask you some questions because I could chat with you all day. But we have a lot of folks who are here. So if anybody would like to, we're monitoring the chat. If anybody has a question that they would like to ask, or you know, anything at all, Olivia Dade is here. While we're waiting for some of those to come in. So we know Shipwrecked is coming out soon, and that's, everything is ready and planned for that. I'm curious if you have any other projects in the works that you can tell us about.
I am right now in the midst of planning the first book in my new series with Avon. So there's a couple aspects to it. Again, I am still planning it, but it's meant to be set in sort of southeastern Maryland, which is actually where I was born, sort of on the water there, in a place called Harlots Bay, which it's not a real place, but I'm making it up as a place that was settled sort of from the 17th century onward by runaway women, essentially, who basically have burned down their lives and need to start over. And so this particular book also involves, have you heard of a spite house?
No.
There's one in Boston. Once we're done, look up Spite House Boston, right?
Okay.
So these are homes, and there are a few of them that are built often they're built out of spite. So the legend of Spite House in Boston, which you can't really confirm or whatever, is that there were two brothers who were given a chunk of land. And one of those brothers went off to the Civil War. And when he came back, his brother had taken the lion's share of the land. So because it cuts off particularly at the time, cut off airflow, cut off light. The building that's right next to it is like 4 or 5 feet away. So there's no view really on that side either. I mean, it was clearly, the legend is, at least, and there's no one who said any differently, is that basically it was built to as a big middle finger to his brother. So this house is people live there. It is 10 feet wide at the widest portion. It is less than that if you go back, but it is quite tall. So basically, it's almost like one room often per story. And I sort of combine those two things so that I have a story where my main character, Athena, was engaged to be married. Well, that's what engaged means. And gave up her job to go live with her fiance, who lives in Harlots Bay. And she was a teacher, and she sort of burned out a little bit and wants to sort of decide what to do next. And he said to her, no problem, I'll support you till you figure out what you want to do. So she sells her, she gives up the lease on her apartment, and then he calls off the wedding. And unfortunately, she's used the last of her savings to buy this spite house because he and his brother are in the two houses on either side, and they've wanted to get rid of the spite house. So she bought it so they could finally get rid of it if they wanted to. But now she has no money and nowhere to go. So she moves into the spite house. And it turns out the person who convinced her fiance not to marry her is his older brother, who lives 4 feet to the side. So while her ex-fiance goes on the honeymoon of her dreams, she decides she's going to wage war against his older brother by tormenting him by being that close. So listening to really embarrassing erotic audiobooks through open windows. And he's scared of, like, he finds Halloween decorations really disturbing, so she's gonna put up like really really hardcore Halloween decorations and a variety of other things. So basically she's gonna make it her business to make him regret having convinced his younger brother to dump her, although of course in the end she will realize that, like, it was the right decision and that he's not that bad a person and she's kind of into him because it's romance. But that's the premise. I'm really excited about it. So
I love it. It sounds really funny. I love Spite House on like multiple levels, like just, spite upon spite upon spite.
Exactly.
That sounds fabulous. You kind of, well, I don't know that you answered it. You talked about both. I'm curious, which ends up coming to you first, the main character when you're writing a story, or something about the story and then you fit characters into it, or does it vary?
It varies. I mean, one book, 40 Love, I wrote almost entirely based on the title. I was after the 2016 election, for a while, I felt like I wasn't able to do much except watch tennis, bizarrely, which I never really watched before. And I was watching a match, and the score was 40-love, and I thought to myself, that would be an excellent romance title if you had a 40-year-old character. And then I extrapolated from there, and that became the book. But it started with just thinking, well, that would be an excellent title. In the case of Spite House, I have a little file that I keep of story ideas. And somebody a few years ago had mentioned the Spite House in Boston. And I wrote to myself in big letters, Spite House. And so I was like, oh, this is a golden opportunity to do Spite House. Just like, have you read Sweetest in the Gale, the stories from there? Have you read that?
Yeah.
Right. So in one of them, Poppy, the art teacher, makes murder dioramas.
Yes.
That was something else that was in my little file, just in all caps. No, there was no explanation. It was just murder dioramas.
I mean, that has to be a really fun Mad Libs to just like shake out the file and then just like push all the little notes together. It's like right. Murder diorama in the Spite House.
I'm sure he would find it disturbing if she made murder dioramas.
I mean, probably. You gotta hold that piece right there.
So it really depends. And sometimes there are certain types of characters I really want to write. Mm-hmm. In the case of Unraveled, which had the murder dioramas, the whole sort of idea behind the anthology that story came from it was called He's Come Undone. It was about starchy male main character who's sort of unraveled by the female main character who's unstarched by the end of it. So I took sort of the premise of the starchy male main character whom I'd want to write, and then added in, I'm like, what's going to unstarch him faster than murder dioramas? Also, I thank you. Was that Jessica? Was that the name?
Yeah, I see Jessica in the chat.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm proudest of in my career, right? If you go on Amazon and look at the reviews, they give you sort of keywords that are commonly found in the reviews. Mm-hmm. And one of my key phrases for the reviews for Sweetest in the Gale is murder dioramas. And I am pretty sure that this is the only romance in Amazon that has as one of the keywords murder dioramas. And I feel like it should be my legacy in romance.
For sure. I definitely that's a business card type thing, romance author, rom-coms, et cetera, author of the murder diorama romance.
Right. Although I want to be clear that murder dioramas are a real thing. You should look up Frances Glessner Lee, who was sort of the inspiration for a lot of that, because the stuff I have in that story about her, she did make murder dioramas, and police still use her murder dioramas to sort of train investigators.
Cool.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Mary, who asked if you can speak on location choice.
So In my earlier books, I really set the books in locations that I felt quite familiar with, because it was sort of making things a little easier on myself. So I was from, again, the Virginia and Maryland area. I've lived various places there. So the Marysburg series is set sort of, it's Williamsburg, William and Mary. It's Williamsburg, Marysburg. It is essentially the Williamsburg area, which is where from age 9 to college is where I lived. And the Love Struck Librarian series is essentially set in a fictionalized version of Hagerstown, Maryland. And I lived there for over a decade. And then we got to my books for Avon with spoiler alert. And like, that was not going to work, because the story that I was going to tell is not a story that could be told in rural Maryland or so forth. It had to be set largely in California or these other places. So I had to do actual like work on the settings. It was really a shame. So I had to do like a lot of research, and I was fortunate that I have a dear friend who lives in San Francisco, in the San Francisco region, Margreta Martin, and she really helped me with spoiler alert. And I have a dear friend, Susanna Irwin, who writes for Harlequin Desire and is amazing. And everything that I hopefully got right about LA and Hollywood is her. It is 1000% Susanna Irwin. And then for this next series, I lived in that area until I was 9. I don't remember a ton about it, but I like the idea of being near the water. I find the water very soothing. And I like the history of that area, because it too has a historical, like Colonial Williamsburg, it has a living history museum. So I thought I could set a book in that series potentially with that, draw on that part of myself. It has a university. I can have like an academic library there and archives, so I could do some librarian stuff. So it felt like that setting could encompass a lot of the things that I love. And I can visit there. When I come to the US, I usually come into Dulles, and it's not that far, Washington Dulles Airport, and it's not that far to that area of the world, that area of the state. So
you've mentioned the Williamsburg, and I know that in your bio you talk about having been a historical interpreter, and I'm now blank. It was the degree in history, a master's degree in history, I believe you said. Have you ever thought about, and this is not trying to shift you off the contemporary rom-coms because I very much enjoy this, but have you thought about or played with the idea of doing historical novel, or is that like, oh, that is work and that is a past part of my life?
I think what stopped me, for about one hot minute, I did consider it, but I am naturally relatively anxious. And my concern was that I would be so worried about getting all the details right in the story that it would be sort of an insurmountable barrier to me actually writing, that I would never actually stop doing the research. I would basically be stopped in my tracks, being like, but what would they do? Like, how did it work back then? Because, even with the history degree, I was in a doctoral program, and I left a bit after the master's because I decided I didn't necessarily want to be in academia. I knew a lot of history, and I was also a history teacher, but that doesn't always, and working in Colonial Williamsburg helped too. But do you actually, with a history, even with a master's degree in history, you don't necessarily know how everything would work in daily lives for people at a certain place at a certain time. And I was just concerned I would never actually write, that I would be frozen by the need to get everything correct. Yeah. And so I was like, you know what, let's set it in a thinly veiled version of where I live now. So that I'll know that what I'm saying is possible and is a reality that exists, so that I can feel confident in that portion of things, so that I can sort of, concentrate more on the story.
Yeah. That definitely makes sense to me. I can absolutely be worried about like, oh my gosh, did they like looking up every single in that big like the full version of the Oxford English Dictionary, like was that word around then? Well, what about this one? That would I can see that being like just overwhelmingly stressful. um do you have this is more just a random thing that has popped into my head. Do you have a favorite like moment in any of your books, a favorite line, a favorite like that you wrote it and you're like that was perfect. That was just perfect. I don't need to edit it, change it. I frame it, it's done.
The there are a lot of lines in, like, I enjoy a lot of dialogue. I would say one of the lines that I especially loved for Alex, which is not necessarily, there are certain lines that are more often highlighted for him, but I really loved when he says please, and Lauren's like, please is not some sort of magical incantation that's like that is guaranteed to give you exactly what you want. And he's like, well, then why have I been bothering all these years? And he doesn't mean it. It's just him being himself. But like that, I always I chuckle to myself every time. I just think it's very funny. One of my favorite scenes in that book, as far as dialogue, is they have breakfast together outside, and there's sort of the banter between the two of them, I think, is some of the best banter I have written. And
beautiful. It's really good.
you get the first sense that he is somewhat obsessed with Pretty Woman in that conversation. I don't know how comfortable you are with using obscenities. That like,
I mean, it's towards the end of our conversation, so if the library gets real mad about it, they can just cut it off, I guess.
So, okay. So yeah, where he's like, he says, all right, let's go. And he wants to go get fancier clothes for her for the charity auction. He's like, let's Pretty Woman this shit. and she says, like, we cannot, as you so beautifully put it, Pretty Woman this shit, because I am not a sex worker. And you are not my John or in any way my client. So that is not actually going to happen. So I know that scene was super fun for me to write. So
yeah, I'll just wrap up. If anybody else has a question, we've got like 5 more minutes. So throw it in now. But thank you so much. This conversation has been absolutely delightful. And thank you for your books, which have given me a lot of joy over the last couple of years. We have Jessica in the chat who's saying there were so many laugh out loud moments in all the feels, and I second that entirely. It's a hysterical, that their whole interaction, the whole thing, just hysterical to me. So yeah, I definitely want to thank you for your writing and how much it's meant to me over the last couple of years. So thank you.
Well, thank you to you, and thank you to Jessica. That's very sweet to say. I wrote it in the early months of the pandemic, and genuinely one of my major goals for that book, other than distinct character points of view within the chapters, was the best banter I could write, because I really wanted readers to be able to laugh, because I had a really bad feeling, given the historical precedent of the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, that it wasn't going to be over quickly, because that's just not historically how things worked. And so I wanted to make readers laugh as much as possible, because I had a bad feeling that even when the book was published months later, that people were still going to need to laugh.
Yeah, I can. It definitely made me laugh. And yeah, that sort of like pick me up feeling without, there's conflict, but it's never like it's conflict that you worry about, like you spoke about at the beginning, but the knowledge that it's going to turn out well and that they are grown-ups that can talk to each other and, you know, get through those conflicts is always very comforting.
Do you know how anxiety averse I am when reading? Even with romances, when we're getting to sort of the bleak moment, I will sometimes skip past the bleak moment to the reconciliation, and then I will go back and like peek back whatever the like argument or the bleak moment is, because I just am like, no, I just have to, I can't like go back to the end, and then I peek back to see what terrible things happened that I skipped over. I'm like, I'm strong enough now. I know how things are going to work out. I'm strong enough to get through the hard moment. I'm so glad that I saw a note about the ADHD rep. I have a loved one with ADHD. It is not the same as having it myself, obviously, but I know a lot about how sort of it manifests from personal experience. And also we took a number of classes about it for my family member who has ADHD that sort of made that it's not just, you know, it's not just hyperactivity. There's executive function, you know, issues, you know, impulsivity and other things like that. So I adore Alex, and his ADHD is not a flaw, it's just part of who he is. I also made sure, because I do not myself have ADHD, that I had, Avon got me a sensitivity reader who has ADHD to read for the representation. And also I had two dear author friends who are they're open about having ADHD. Bryna Starler and Meryl Wilsner both read it over for me specifically to make sure that there was nothing harmful in there. So it makes me very happy that you feel like I got it right, because that was important to me.
I definitely, it's fabulous that you got the extra writers and everything, because what struck me in reading Alex is that it wasn't a very surface level presentation of like, oh, he's just really hyper all the time, and that's such a stereotype that's really misguided and I think hurtful to folks who do have it. Is like, that's not all that's going on there, and that's such a shallow presentation of it. So I really loved, I also don't know the commenter's name, but I loved that as well.
That makes me very happy that you felt like it was good representation of that, because it was very important to me.
Is there anybody else who wants to add anything? Because if not, I'm going to thank you, because I think it is now 10 o'clock your time, Olivia.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your time and for joining us with this big time gap as well. And spending your weekend. But we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jessica. It's been a delight, and Katrina has been absolutely wonderful, and I'm just very honored that you wanted to chat with me. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.